Well, good evening and welcome back to the Journey Home program. I'm your host, John Mark Grodi, and once again, we have this wonderful opportunity to come together to hear the story of how the Lord has worked in someone's life to bring them closer to Christ, closer to His church. We're speaking tonight with Deacon Joe Allison. He's a former evangelical minister. Deacon, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, John.
We actually have a written version of your story at chnetwork.org that people can check out. I'll mention that later, the title, they can check you out there. But I'm excited to hear your story. We were chatting a bit beforehand. There's a lot of neat aspects of your story, particularly nowadays. I know one thing that will come up later, talking a bit about some of the life issues, contraception, that kind of stuff. A lot of good things in your story. So excited to hear it. So thank you for being here.
Again, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Appreciate
absolutely. So where does this begin? Let's go back to the beginning. You were raised Southern Baptist.
Yep.
Talk about that background.
Yeah, my family, we had pastors and missionaries on both sides of my family. My parents actually met in a small Southern Baptist church where they were married and grew up there. And earliest memories are going to church with my Bible in one hand and my tithe envelope in the other. And I remember, as I said, the ministers in the family, I had one older cousin who was with the Southern Baptist Mission Board, and he'd spent years in Israel and Yemen. And I remember as a young boy, we would go over and visit, and they would show us slides of the work they had done there in those countries. And I think it was then just realizing I wanted to be a missionary. And growing up Southern Baptist, every service ended with an altar call, just as I am, without one plea. And when I was 8 years old, I got up and went down and invited Jesus in my heart, received baptism, and just had a very deep relationship with God. Just loved Him. And then going into my teen years, though, went into a profound period of rebellion. Mark Twain once said, when a child turns 12, you should stick him in a hole and feed him through the barrel. And when you turn 13, you should plug up the hole. Anyways, my parents would have been wise to take that advice. So really just put them through a really bad place throughout my high school years until I became a senior, and I came across a book called There's a New World Coming by an author named Hal Lindsey. This was back in the early 80s when a particular brand of eschatology was real popular, premillennialism, Jesus is coming back soon. And the book was wonderful in my life because it awakened my relationship with God. I remembered, that faith I had as a child, and I embraced it again. The downfall was that the book talked about Jesus' imminent return. And so I basically sat around a few years waiting for Jesus to get back.
Right.
And after a few years realizing that wasn't going to happen right away, started making plans to go into missions. Was involved in several different training programs. Eventually, I went with a group called Youth with a Mission, or YWAM.
I've heard that name before.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, YWAM is an international, interdenominational group of missionaries, all faith-based, meaning they raise their own support. It's international. It's everywhere. I don't think there's any country you can go to the world where there's not a YWAM presence. The idea behind YWAM is to know God and to make Him known. And then they're involved in three different kinds of ministry: evangelism, discipleship, and mercy ministries. And so, again, that training I thought would be important, so I went ahead and did the discipleship training school. And it was there I met my wife, Lucy. The school we attended was it was the YWAM Mercy Ship, the Anastasis. The Anastasis was an ocean liner that had been re-outfitted as a hospital/cargo ship. And so we met there. And then we were both planning on going to full-time ministry, but decided to get married first. So we took some time off, got married, had some children, and eventually attended some more training because we wanted to work with youth, children and teens. And so we went to a training program for that called Principles of Child and Youth Ministries up in Vancouver. And after that time, we eventually were able to settle in Atlanta, where we were involved in, first of all, the area of reconciliation. There was an old saying in Atlanta that the most segregated place in Atlanta was any given church on a Sunday morning. And so we, as part of our ministry, we were part of two churches which had a sister relationship, an Anglo parish, which was out in the suburbs in Snellville, and an inner city African-American parish, which was right downtown Atlanta. And so we would alternate between the two. We were working to develop an inner city youth ministry, in one of the housing projects. And then also we would take teams of young people on mission outreaches. So we were having a great time. And
this is still non-denominational, interdenominational?
Yeah, so Youth with a Mission.
Generally Christian, okay.
Yep. And so there was people from all different kinds of backgrounds.
And what was your sense of that? Again, growing up Baptist and moving into sort of this interdenominational, was there a sense that there was any issue with? Was it just generically Christian? Did the denominational differences, the theological differences,
No, it didn't matter. No,
so that was just sort of
we
peripheral.
would attended churches where we felt that the faith was being presented.
Right.
Right. And so, growing up fundamentalist, very much so. But then, as a young man, moving towards more into the evangelical circles of just being more open to, not just a strict fundamentalist. This is the only way a person can believe, and that comes with different baggage for different people.
Right.
But for us, we'd kind of come away from that. And so again, with YWAM, just meeting people from all different faith backgrounds, and it was fine.
Yeah.
Now, something that did happen while we were there in Atlanta, and you touched on it before, was came across a article on Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, all I knew about her was that she had founded Planned Parenthood. And so I read this article just out of curiosity. And it presented her as somebody who was born to have a cause. And she found her cause in championing birth control. Now, when she did this, birth control was illegal. This is back in the 1920s, and every church taught against it. And as I said, it was, state and federal government laws were against it. And so she started publishing a magazine, and that's how they got her, because she was sending this out through the mail and that seditious material. And so she had to flee to Europe to prepare her case. And she came back to fight it, but she didn't have to, because the cases were just dropped, the laws were changed. And then in the 1930s, the Episcopal Church became the first church at the Lambeth Conference, which allowed for birth control in certain circumstances. They would just kind of open the door, but that was it. Very soon, all the Christian denominations followed. And so, except for one, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I didn't know any of this at the time. And for me, birth control wasn't even an issue. Growing up Southern Baptist, I remember, that round package of pink pills my mom took every day. She explained what it was for, and it made sense. And my wife and I were in premarital counseling with the Protestant minister. Asked us, "Have you decided what kind of birth control you're going to use?" And of course we had. We thought about that. We wanted to be responsible. And so, anyways, reading this article, what got me was the, first of all, again, birth control not even being on my radar. I heard all of 2 sermons that there might be something wrong with it in my many years as a Christian, and those sermons were by older men who were well past child rearing years, so I didn't even listen. I was my own magisterium. I could take and choose what I wanted to believe. But reading this article, the name of her magazine was Rebel Woman, but it was the motto of the magazine that got me: no gods, no masters. And I felt like I got hit with a brick, because coming to realize that birth control began when a woman shook her fist in the face of God and said, "We will have none of you." And so Lucy and I together, as we saw that, and we began to look at birth control much more closely, and realizing it didn't really pick up until the 1950s, after World War II, which was really when birth control became available. There really wasn't anything, so to speak, before that. And something else rose along with the use of birth control, and that was the divorce rate. And as we looked into it, we began to see just the devastation that birth control had wrought on our culture. And so, anyway, so Lucy and I, we cleaned out our medicine cabinet, started to learn natural family planning, but again, I think it was the realization that I could be wrong about something that I always took for granted really shook me.
We're speaking tonight with Deacon Joe Allison, a former evangelical minister, and his written stories at chnetwork.org. The title is "I Was an Evangelical Minister Minding My Own Business." And so this article, again, came out of nowhere, and as you said, like this realization that, well, maybe I could be wrong about this, maybe there's more to get into here. Mm-hmm. The difference between contraception and, you mentioned, natural family planning, it can be a subtle one for we in a culture where contraception is just so normal, but it's really, again, like, it's how we think of this gift of human sexuality, and that it has a nature that we don't determine, that it's something that we receive, and there's a big mindset switch in those 2 different approaches. Right.
Yeah, and so definitely. And so again, learning that, again, not to use natural family planning as birth control. And that's a whole other concept that has to be broken free of, but just the realization that the church doesn't teach that we have to have as many children as we're physically able to have, and that there might be times in a family's life when, conception would not be in the best interest of the mother, perhaps, or anyway. So, that settled that unsettlement of just like, what else do I think I know? Right. That I may not be too sure about. Yeah. And so it was probably about a year later, my family, it was Christmas break. We were visiting Lucy's family down in southeast Georgia. And as I said before, Lucy grew up Catholic.
Okay.
And but over the years, most of her family had drifted away from the Catholic Church, except for one sister she has, her oldest sister. And we were visiting that sister, and on the coffee table was a book called Born Fundamentalist, Born Again Catholic by a fellow named David Curry. And I have to confess, when I saw that book, I thought it was a joke book. I thought it was written by Dave Barry, because most of the Catholics I knew were Protestants. I never heard of a Catholic that became, a fundamentalist Christian, or any Christian that became Catholic. It was just like, that didn't make any sense whatsoever. And so I picked this book just out of curiosity and started reading it. But what I realized right away is that his background was very similar to mine. Being born, raised fundamentalist, but then going into more an evangelical mindset. I remember one thing he said in the book was that, again, there was probably times in my life when I was anti-Catholic, especially, again, as a young man coming across Jack Chick tracts. I don't know if you've ever read those, the Crusader comic books, and the story of Alberto Rivera, the renegade Jesuit priest who the Jesuits were trying to kill. So that was very exciting reading when I was young. But that idea that the Catholic Church was evil, I came to realize that was nonsense. So, but I just thought it was irrelevant. What difference did it make? Again, and most of the Catholics I knew were Protestants.
Right.
And so
you weren't a Protestant who was protesting the Catholic Church?
No, it wasn't even on my radar.
Right.
I was minding my own business.
Yeah, that's right.
and so, but again, his testimony just really rung a bell. And one of the things he said that just, again, so struck me, that he'd come to a place in that he did not think that that a Catholic couldn't be saved. Because, I mean, there's some Christian sects would really question whether or not a Catholic can experience salvation. He wasn't there, he said, but that he thought that there were certain Catholic doctrines that you just couldn't take. You couldn't believe them. They were just some doctrines. And so there were probably some things that Catholics just didn't believe that the Catholic Church taught, and they would be okay. And I thought, well, that sounds right. I'm sure that those doctrines are, because I've heard about these from my ex-Catholic friends, and just crazy things that they would do as Catholics, and praying to saints, worshiping Mary, and on down, just a laundry list of. And so the second part of the book, he dealt with various doctrines of the Catholic Church. So I thought, well, I'll just read which ones you can't believe. I'll just go through this, and I'll find those ones that he just points to being beyond appeal. But it didn't do that. Using scripture and church history, he gave a very convincing argument for what the church taught, and I realized I didn't know what the church taught. I do have to confess here, one of the chapters that really gave me a little trepidation was his chapter on eschatology.
Right.
Because again, I told you that I cut my teeth on there's an world coming, and premillennial theology, that Jesus is going to come back and how that all plays out. So I was very nervous about what the Catholic Church taught. And so basically he broke it down to the fundamentalist group that I came from, that he came from, that I shared, was very premillennial. That millennial theology is that Jesus is going to come back and reign for 1,000 years. And so the branch I was in believed that before Jesus did that, there would be a rapture, that he would come back, take away the true believers, and then after 7 years of tribulation, in which the world would suffer under the reign of the Antichrist, Jesus would come back and set up his kingdom in Israel. At the end of that 1,000 years, Satan would be loosed and would go out to deceive the world. And then Jesus would then shut it all down, establish heaven on earth. And so I was very curious, where did he put that? Well, he talked about the Catholic Church being amillennial, meaning that we're living in the millennial reign of Christ. And I remember reading that thinking, well, if that's the case, then there'd have to be a church somewhere that was prominent and that had a hierarchy and a leadership and an authority structure. And where in the world is that possible? And the Catholic Church. Okay, I get it. I understood. And for me, that answered that question. I just put it at peace. And so
We put it at peace.
in my own heart, that okay, I can handle the Catholic Church eschatology.
The eschatology piece.
Yeah,
okay.
I can understand that.
That is okay. That's not as crazy as it sounds, right?
Not as crazy as it sounds.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Again, just understanding Catholic theology from a Catholic perspective, it wasn't as sinister. It
Right.
wasn't as ominous, like things being pulled out of whole cloth or being invented by Constantine or various people throughout Catholic history,
Sure.
putting spin on things. So it started just a deep, wanting to know more. Maybe the Catholic Church wasn't irrelevant, and if not, then I needed to get my head around it. Because loving Jesus, I wanted to be where he is, and so Well, it's something that happened right there at the beginning. I was talking to two friends independently of each other and telling them about this crazy book I was reading about this guy that became Catholic. And I thought they would laugh. I thought they would say, well, that's crazy. What's it about? But it wasn't the response. Both of them, totally independent, suddenly got real serious and said, what are you reading that for? And I quickly realized that this interest was viewed as a threat. People saw it as something threatening. And so I shut up. I quit talking to people about what I was reading. And so, but I didn't quit looking. There was a Catholic bookstore nearby that I became their biggest patron for the next month. I went in there and I got everything I could get my hands on. Catholic Bible, a catechism. Right. And so as after about a month, one of the folks there said, why don't you should call a Catholic church and talk to a priest or deacon. It's like, oh no, I'm fine. I can do this. Yeah. But a few more weeks passed by and I finally got up the nerve. And I went into work one morning early to the YWAM office and called the Catholic church nearby and asked to talk to a priest or deacon about the Catholic faith. And they said, well, there's no one here right now, but we'll have somebody call you later. And so it was a few hours later when the office was full of people. You know, it was busy, and the phone rang and somebody said, hey, Joe, you got a call from Deacon Tom. And I said, I'll get it in the other room. So I snuck into the other room, picked up the phone, whispered into it, I'd like to talk to you about the Catholic Church. And Deacon Tom, a very perceptive man, said, is this not a good time? Like, no, it's not. And so he invited me to come down to the church to meet with him. And I remember going there that day. It was, I'll never forget it. I felt like I was going down a roller coaster, a very steep climb. My stomach was turning somersaults just driving to the parking lot. And but Deacon Tom, he was there, and I didn't know it at the time, but I was blessed because he was wonderfully Orthodox. He loved the Catholic faith. And since then, hearing stories of people who met deacons or priests who kind of put them off. Right. And thankful be to God, that was my experience. Yeah. He really shepherded us. Well, sitting down with him, he started explaining to me about how RCIA was going, and Easter was just around the corner, and that there was going to be a group of people coming into the Catholic Church. And I thought to myself, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Okay. I said, well, I guess I'll become Catholic too. He said, no, slow down. He said, the Catholic Church doesn't do anything fast. There's no hurry. And so for the rest of the summer, we just met and talked, Lucy and I together. And something else that was happening that summer was we were organizing a youth mission trip to Perm, Russia. And again, because of the negative reactions I got from people, I felt like I better not tell anybody what we're doing here because I'm going to rock the boat and could jeopardize the trip. So we continued to pray and study, but we just kept it quiet. And that summer we went on a trip. It was wonderful. And something happened in that summer as well, again, through the prayer and study. I realized that as a Christian, I had a relationship with the Bible, that I knew the Bible was the Word of God. And yet I also knew that there were parts of the Bible that I didn't understand. But when I came to those parts of the Bible, I never said, well, I can't believe this because I don't understand it. I said, well, I don't understand this, but if there's a problem, it's me. And if I pray and if I study, then I will come to understand. And I realized that I had to take that confidence that I had in the Bible and put it in the church, make a paradigm shift. That put that confidence that if the church is teaching something that I don't understand, then the problem is me. It's not the church. And I realized in some way that was already starting to happen. Well, at that point, Lucy and I sat down with our YWAM leadership. We were involved with several churches. We sat down with them all one by one and explained what was happening, that we were in this serious study, seriously considering becoming Catholic. And the first thing that all of them did was said, don't tell anybody. Yeah. Keep it quiet.
That whole situation, again, something that we're very familiar with at the Coming Home Network. And again, many people listening who haven't been in that situation don't recognize the gravity, again, of continuing to be an active ministry, which you had been called to, you'd given your life to, but then having this spiritual journey to then have to break that to people and begin to deal with the fallout. It's a difficult thing. But so don't tell anyone, right?
And what we realized quickly, what we were doing is we were saying, YWAM is international, interdenominational, so can we just keep doing this? It's an interdenominational ministry. Can we just stay here and do it as Catholics? Now, I think if a Catholic wanted to join YWAM, it wouldn't be a problem. But where we were in Atlanta, we were on the board of directors, we ran one of the ministries, and I think we were we were basically asking, can we keep doing this as Catholics? And we realized we were asking these folks who we loved to make this decision for us. And we realized that wasn't fair. Right. And so we offered our resignation and just stepped down. And at that point, we thought we were done. We thought all ministry in the church is done by priests and religious, so began looking at the possibility of going back, finishing my college degree, looking for a new line of work. Well, on a lark, I called Franciscan University of Steubenville. And as I spoke to them there, I realized that no, there's many opportunities for ministries for lay people in the Catholic Church. And before we knew it, God was opening up door after door, and we were soon making plans to go to Steubenville.
And this is still before you.
Before we're Catholic.
Yeah.
Before we're Catholic. I'm in the RCI program, and still working closely with Deacon Tom. And suddenly things just sped up so fast. And so it was on at the beginning of that December of that year, that was 1998, a year after we'd found that book, our marriage was convalidated, and Lucy came back to the sacraments. And then on December 27th of that year, the Feast of the Holy Family, I was confirmed to receive my first communion. Our 3 children were baptized. And the next morning, we loaded everything we owned in a truck and moved to Steubenville.
Wow.
And got there in the middle of an ice storm, which for me was a whole new experience.
Right.
Growing up in Fort Lauderdale, we didn't even know we had any neighbors for 3 months. Nobody came out of their houses. And it wasn't long there that realized that ice storm was indicative of our lives, because becoming Catholic, we had a lot of friends, and most of our family did not understand what was happening. And so now we're in a new place where we don't know anybody, and there was no place to turn to as the loneliness set in. And I remember there was times thinking, did we do the right thing? And so that was, that there was a heaviness there until we got to Easter. And that Easter vigil, there at Franciscan, they have the vigil service in Finnegan Fieldhouse, which is a large gym, and they pack it out. And growing up Christian, I had been to Easter services my entire life. And yet that evening, sitting in that field house in the dark as the scriptures were read, and then the Gloria is exclaimed and sung with joy, and the lights come on, and people are moving through the aisles, dancing and joy, and just realizing this is what happened 2,000 years ago when Jesus came out of the tomb. It was an explosion of life. And I realized, we're home. This is where we belong.
Yeah.
And so, never looked back from that point.
That's beautiful. We're going to take a break here in a couple minutes, and when we come back, so we've gotten you into the church now. We're going to circle back on some of the barriers, some of the issues that that it's a big switch from a Baptist sort of theology, your eschatology, different aspects there. Dig more into those issues, and then we'll talk more a bit about what's happened since, as a new Catholic, and as you continue to unpack it and the conversion continues. So we'll be back with you in a couple minutes. I want to remind you, as always, that if you go to chnetwork.org, you can find a whole archive of stories, some like Deacon Joe's, but many others, all different backgrounds, all different scenarios. We encourage you to check that out, because there's always there's a particular story that speaks to you where you're at. And so again, also, if you're on a journey to the church, or if you're thinking about becoming Catholic, or if you have questions, we'd love to journey along with you. So check out chnetwork.org. We'll be back in just a couple minutes to hear more of Deacon Joe's story. See you in a minute. Hello and welcome back to the Journey Home program. I'm your host, John Mark Grodi. We're in the second half of this hour. We're speaking to Deacon Joe Allison tonight. He's a former evangelical minister, and his written story, a written version of his testimony, can be found at chnetwork.org. It's titled, "I Was an Evangelical Minister Minding My Own Business." I love that title. And he's been telling us his story. Grew up as a Baptist, and he was involved in YWAM and ministry, and again, minding his own business. And some things came and turned the tables. And we left off, you just entered the church with your family, and it's a wonderful story. I wanted to circle back around on a few topics that you'd mentioned, to dig in a little bit further. And one of them that I had in mind, you mentioned history a couple times, and that's always a big one. We often come from backgrounds where there's not really a sense of church history. Talk about, from your perspective as a Baptist and your family and kind of what you grew up with, what was the sense of church history, and how did that begin to open up for you and change and shift as you looked into the Catholic Church?
Well, to be honest, not much. Right. I mean, as growing up, history wasn't part of it. It was more the personal relationship with Jesus.
Right.
I guess, and then I mentioned about the Jack Chick comic books, and they purported history about things the Catholic Church has done, and I don't know. I guess as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, I probably went to the school of thought that Constantine made the Catholic Church. Sure. That the early church with the apostles was Southern Baptist, and then Constantine came along and messed everything up.
Yeah.
And it was later, after the Reformation, that people got back to the real church, the Bible church, the Christian fellowship. And I guess I never really thought that much about it until, again, becoming Catholic and wondering, just was the Catholic Church the church Jesus started? I never thought of that. And again, I guess as a Protestant, it was always me and Jesus, not me and the church.
Right.
That's why it wasn't really important to me what church I went to, what the denominational label was, so long as the pastor was a man of God who believed the Bible was the Word of God. And in the different denominations we were involved in, I saw pastors on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so again, the denomination wasn't so important as that church, but again, at the same time, if I remember I was involved in two very large Southern Baptist churches that one day half the church got mad at the pastor and they went across the street and started a new church.
Right.
And so, history didn't play into it too much.
Yeah.
And even theology, I remember, I think one of my frustrations as a Protestant was not knowing who was right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would take a class on John Calvin and say, well, this is brilliant. I mean, and John Calvin is brilliant.
Yeah.
He starts on a very flawed plan, but it's a brilliant house he builds, but it's on a house of sand. But it sounded good. And then reading about John Wesley and what he was doing and how that sounded good. But then John Wesley said, John Calvin's God is my devil. And it's like, well, who's right? And not just those two, but just on down the line, they're just who is right? And for me, I remember the idea of a magisterium, a teaching authority that settles the question, who is right? That, for me, coming into the church, that was a comfort. And so I don't know if it was so much history as the theology,
Sure.
especially just a scattershot approach of so many different brands of theology in the Protestant world.
All purporting to be Scripture alone.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's why there's 30,000 denominations, Christian denominations, because everybody has the Bible and they know what it means.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned again this emphasis on the personal relationship with Christ and the me and Jesus, and there's certainly, I mean, there's a piece of that that's certainly obviously true, and that's why, in your story and so many other stories, you came to know Christ through people who loved Jesus.
Right.
Their witness, their testimony, their teaching, and that is an absolutely wonderful thing, right? But then there's a missing piece there, which is that, well, that's is supposed to happen in the context of a body.
Right.
Of a family, and in the context of a church that can help us to refine that relationship and direct us to the right way of worship. I wanted to ask about worship. So a Baptist context, right? That wouldn't have been a liturgical sort of worship style.
No, I think it's very common to most fundamental type sects. I hate to even use that word though.
Sure.
But you'd have half of the service would be worship, which for us was singing. Hymns and nowadays the more modern Protestant church I was going to would be, we didn't have the hymn books, and the songs were more contemporary, but it was always, half of it was always the singing, which we would call worship, and then the other half would be preaching. And then in growing Southern Baptist, it would always end with an altar call. Every head bow, every eye closed, and so that was my experience. The idea of a liturgy was just like totally like, what is that?
Right.
And so again, I remember for the first time going to the Catholic Church, it's like thinking, wow, these guys are doing business with God. They're standing, they're kneeling, they're up here. I mentioned earlier about the idea of reconciliation that we were involved in that ministry in Atlanta. One thing I forgot to mention was when I started RCIA that fall, I started going to Mass, it was revolutionary because it wasn't just Anglo-Americans and African-Americans. There was Asians, there was Hispanics, there was everybody. And the Catholic Church, it was not the most segregated place in Atlanta. Everybody was present. And just realizing that this is Jesus' church, where all are one, all are welcome. There is no dividing line of anything. And so, again, that was one of those other thoughts, like, okay, we're home. This is where we should be.
Yeah, that aspect I find really fascinating, thinking of, because you mentioned earlier about the experience that, again, many of our guests talk about, coming from very faithful groups of Christians who love Jesus, and yet something happens and then there's a split. There's a divorce, the body divides. And it seems like one of the differences between Catholicism as a church and many Protestant communities is that there's a sense in which a Protestant community comes together because at this particular time and place, there's a synergy, there's a sympathy of theology, our sense of the Bible, what we're into right now. But the thing is like what carries that through over time. What keeps that family together, right, when things get tough, when there's a scandal, when there's a difficulty. And I think for Catholicism, it's more that this is a family. This is
Right.
this is a marriage. This is not something I have the
That's
power
right.
to.
Yeah, and just like in your family, you have people you don't get along with, but they're still your family.
Right.
And that's the Catholic Church. It's again, having been in Protestant churches would split. They go their separate ways. The Catholic Church, they might get mad at each other, but there's no splitting.
Right.
Everybody stays put. And again, that's that family. The beauty of we're all in this together.
Yeah. You stay and fight. You
Yeah.
stay and fight for the family. Yeah, that's good. I wanted to ask about Mary and the saints. You mentioned that as something that you'd heard kind of peripherally from people about the Catholic Church. Oh, they worship
Right.
Mary, they pray to the saints. Talk about, again, that, what you kind of had a loose sense of what that, how did you come?
When I came into the church, I was very glad they asked me, I was asked, do you believe everything the Catholic Church teaches? And they didn't ask me, do you understand everything the Catholic Church teaches? I probably would not have come into the church. Because there was and one thing that I did not understand was Mary. Where I grew up, there was a church nearby, Mary, Queen of Heaven. And that made me so mad. How dare they call Mary the Queen of Heaven? That's just idolatry. And, but as I said, what happened was after we came into the church, God's grace, we went to Franciscan University, where I was able to study Catholic theology from people who knew and loved it. And I was able to take a class on Mariology with Dr. Mark Miravalli, who is an international known Mariologist, wonderful teacher. And what he did for me was he unpacked what I already knew as Protestant. I didn't know it. I didn't know what I knew. One of my complaints about Mary, and it was common, was that Mary's just not mentioned much in Scripture. And so she's just in a few verses here and there. And at times she appears to show up and to contradict Jesus or to want to take him home because he's not doing well. And she shows up with his brothers. Again, and so anyways, why does the church teach all this about Mary? She's ever virgin. So what he did was he began in the book of Genesis. And he talked about God speaking to the serpent, telling the serpent, I'm going to make you and the woman enemies of each other. And he started asking us, who's that woman? I had never thought of it. And as I thought about Eve, because she was there, it's like, no, it wasn't Eve, because Eve was not at enmity with the serpent. And it was a woman who would have whose seed would crush the serpent. Now, what woman had that seed? Mary? Yes. So then he went to the last book of the Bible, book of Revelation, Revelation 12, where we see the woman clothed with a son, giving birth to a child who will rule the nations. Who's that woman? I don't know. Never thought about it. And but what woman gave birth to a child who would rule the nations? Mary? He said, that's right. That's why John Paul II called Mary the bookends of Scripture. And I knew that, but I never knew that.
Right.
But then what really struck home was when he started talking about the line of David, because Jesus is the king in the line of David, the fulfillment of that prophecy. And one of the things I always knew in reading the Old Testament was that whenever a man would become the king of Judah, it would always tell us who his mother was, never his wife, because he would have many wives, but it'd always say his mother's name was. And Dr. Miravalli explained to us that was the Gobira, the great lady. And among the kings of Judah, it was not the king's wife who would become the queen. It was his mother who would become the queen. She was the Gobira, the great lady, the advocate of the people, the mother of my Lord. And those were the very words that Mary greeted Elizabeth with when she came at the visitation. Why is it granted that the mother of my Lord should come to me? And again, just connecting those dots. Well, Jesus is the king, and Mary is his mother, so Mary would be the queen of his kingdom. And so again, it was just all these loose ends that I'd never connected, that just realizing this is not something foreign. This is something I already know. It's just, and it's not as sinister as I thought it was. It's actually beautiful. Right. That Mary is, and then with that Marian reference, just reading through the Bible, and she's all over the place, from the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament to the Song of Songs. She's everywhere. And then, so that whole Mary question was answered.
Right.
But again, was that confidence in the church that if I don't understand something, if I pray, if I study, the understanding will come.
Right. Yeah. You begin with a theory, and then it fleshes out over time in praxis. I mean, so in terms of praying to Mary, in terms of,
right.
Talk more about that and the
again,
saints.
The idea of praying, for me, I realize it's semantics.
Yeah.
When praying to Mary, as a Protestant, when I said prayer, I meant worship.
Right.
Praying is worship. And so when somebody would say we are praying to saints, that means you're worshiping saints. And it was coming to the understanding that that's not the only definition of the word prayer. Prayer actually is more of a form of discourse, Like we'd see it more in Old English, where like, pray, what did you mean by that?
I prithee.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, we've lost the use of the word, but it's still the meaning of the word. And so prayer is really just conversation. And so the idea too that praying to saints, praying, and I guess this is another thing, just one of those points, that, connecting the dots, is that all of us have people who've passed on, and we all talk to them. Maybe our grandparents, our mother or father, and throughout the days, we'll, Mom, I miss you. Dad, I wish I could ask you this question. And we know in some mysterious way they hear us, right? That's a human experience. We all do that. And so, and Protestants do that. And when we talk about praying to saints, that's what we mean, is that we know the saints are still present to us. They still hear us, and they can still help us. Because, and what we're actually asking them to do is to pray for us. We're not asking them to do it. We're asking them to go to the Father, who's present therein, and ask him this favor for us. And so again, it's that mystery of like understanding what it means to pray,
Right.
that it's not an act of worship. And the fact that in worship, there's two different English words, I'm sorry, I should say Latin words, translated worship. One is latria, and latria is the worship given to God. And latria is for God alone. That's and an English word, that's a better translation, is adoration. That's why we have times of adoration before the Blessed Sacrament,
Right.
adoration chapels. The other word is dulia. Dulia is a reverence and a veneration given to others who are not God. And again, a better word is veneration. We venerate the saints, we honor them, but we do not worship them, we do not adore them. And so again, just understanding what words mean does a lot to, again, kind of pull back that veil of mystery of what's going on back here. So
I like to say that worship is a little bit like murder. I mean,
Okay.
you can't accidentally murder, or it's not murder, right? Like you can't I think there's sometimes this sense of, well, I might accidentally worship someone that's not God.
Okay.
But no, that the reason we have those words to refer to different kinds of worship, because to worship God as God is something very specific.
Right.
Because you're recognizing him as something that is unlike any other thing.
Right.
The original, the creator, the first, the unmoved mover, the whole deal, right? And that kind of worship is a very unique and specific thing. Whereas we have all through our life, we have all sorts of reverence and honor and ways that we relate to different people, that involve a respect, that involve a reverence, but it's not worship, right? In that sense. I wanted to go back. It's the sense of, again, discourse, prayer with the saints. It's scriptural, but I love that perhaps even more. I mean, the reason that we all have a sense of it is that it's such a human thing, as you were saying.
Right.
I think throughout human history, throughout culture, throughout religion, even outside of Christianity, there's a sense that there's something beyond, and we remain connected to people, right? And so that I appreciate when the church is able to to recognize, in its theology, something that's a natural human impulse, sort of written on our hearts.
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It would.
It would. Yeah. Very good. Let's see. I wanted to talk about the sacraments. Again, that's a big change, right, from your background. Is a church now a Christian faith that involves sacramental realities. Talk about discovering those.
I think that's one of the things, coming into the Catholic Church, the idea of the incarnation and the change it really did bring upon the world. Everything changed when God became man. Now, I knew that as a Protestant, but it didn't go to the logical conclusion that if everything changed, then ordinary things can take on, natural things can take on supernatural meaning and power. And so water can wash away sin. Bread and wine can become the body and blood of Christ, all because of the incarnation. And so, for the sacraments are just God has told us we have to be holy because he is holy. Now, if he told us we have to be holy, good luck, you're on your own, we could never do it. And he knows that. And so he's given us the means by which we can become holy, the grace of the sacraments. One of the things I've always loved about the Bible is the Genesis story. And I think everything that we as human beings need to know is there. Now, we try to dismiss it, I think, too often, too quickly, and and I think that's why people are so confused now. But one of the beautiful images of what happened in the garden was when Adam was alone, and God caused Adam to go into a deep sleep and brought out of Adam's side a rib, which he fashioned into a woman, to Eve. And Jesus, the new Adam, when he's asleep on the cross, from his side comes his wife. When the soldiers pierces his side with a lance, and blood and water flow out. And that's the water of baptism and the blood of the Eucharist. So as Jesus is asleep on the cross, out of his side comes his wife, the Catholic Church.
Right.
And so, again, that beautiful imagery and how everything that Adam lost through his sin is now restored through Christ. Everything that we had forfeited in sin is now, but there's still the battle. There's still the struggle with sin. But now God has given us the means to become holy through the waters of baptism, through the grace of confession, through the reception of the Eucharist, through the sacraments, God has put in place to lead and guide us. And not just lead and guide us, but to empower us, to give us the grace that we need in order to become the saints that he's called us to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes Catholicism is thought of in fundamentalist circles as a religion of works and stuff and things you got to do. The sacraments, they are precisely not that.
Right.
Because they're not something that you're doing.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It's something we receive from God.
Right. It's not magic. We're not doing it.
Right.
God is doing it.
Yeah.
He just, in the mystery of his grace, he allows us to share in that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, very good. So let's go back then to you just entered the church. Talk a bit more about now as new Catholics, unpacking that, that experience.
Well, it's for us, it was a whirlwind.
Sure.
Because I said, we came into the church the next day, we loaded everything we owned in a truck and moved and started all over again. And it was a wild world. I remember, and so I got there and the semester started and so now I'm in class and I'm 35 years old. And I was sitting in class with 18-year-olds, taking class, and learning. And I remember at one point I had an 8 a.m. metaphysics class. I didn't even know what metaphysics were. I mean, when I signed me up, I thought metaphysics was that weird section in the bookstore with all the strange things. But no, metaphysics is beautiful. But sitting at 8 a.m. in the morning, it was a whole new experience, and it was great. But so for me, it was a whirlwind. It was just I was always trying to catch my breath. It was very exciting. I was blessed at Franciscan because I was, when I was coming into the church, I felt like the Lord spoke to me one morning that I was to be a catechist. I didn't know what a catechist was. I thought, there was all these catist words, catechumen, catechumenate, catechist.
A lot of cat stuff.
Cat stuff, yeah. And so when I got up there, my supervisor, the lady that was helping me with my classes was Barbara Morgan, who started the catechetics program there at Franciscan. And so I immediately got plugged into all of this, and it was fantastic, but it was a whirlwind. And so, everyone who knew Barbara Morgan knew that God loves you and Barbara has a wonderful plan for your life. And we were kept very, very busy. And so, I mean, I've been spoiled my whole life as a Catholic. I mean, I've met so many wonderful folks who have had really rough experiences in different churches they've been a part of or gone through. And for me, it's been a total blessing. From the church in Atlanta to Holy Family in Steubenville, Ohio, to Franciscan, to leaving there, where the church we're at now, St. Raphael's and Lehigh Acres down in Florida, have been churches that have loved Jesus Christ, have loved the Mass. And I've never encountered any of the friction or any of the horror stories that other people have shared with me. And so I'm very grateful for that, just the gift of God's grace. But yeah, so we hit the ground running.
Yeah. So did you continue the catechetics program? Is that a ministry that you talk about your ministry since then?
Yeah. In fact, what happened was when I graduated from Franciscan, I was hired at my church as the DRE, the Director of Religious Education. So that's what I'm still doing. Awesome. So teaching the faith, and we're actually helping the teachers teach the faith, and but sacramental prep, and again the diaconate. That was something because I think it was Deacon Tom's influence in my life. He kind of put that kind of bug in my ear about, maybe God's calling me to do this. And when I got to Steubenville, I asked around and found out that deacons are ordained in the diocese that they're going to serve in. And so it was like, I knew I was going to stay in Steubenville because it's just too darn cold. And so once I got down to, our church, I talked to my pastor there at the time, and he was very pro-diaconate, got me in touch with the program. And so, God's opened up all those doors as well. And I think the grace of the sacrament has been just the grace to augment that catechesis, just the grace to do that work God's called me to do.
That's wonderful. I want to ask you about again, this journey begins, as so many of the stories that we hear on the Journey Home program. It began with a love of Christ, and close to His scriptures and that. and then so then you get into all the mess of theology and figuring out the church and enter in. Talk now about, since you've become Catholic, how has talk about some of the ways your Christian journey has continued now as a Catholic, maybe in unexpected ways, in terms of devotion and practice and prayer. How is that conversion continuing? You're deeper into Christ. What are some things maybe that you didn't expect to love in the context of the Catholic faith that you love?
I don't know if there's anything I expected not to love. I mean, it was all so new to me.
Yeah.
As I said, everything I thought I knew about the Catholic Church, I'd been taught by as Catholics.